The Battle of Stalingrad is one of the best-known battles of World War II, and certainly one of the most important. For almost 200 days, Germans and Soviets faced each other in a destroyed city, in inhumane conditions. The winter cold, extreme hunger, and epidemic diseases killed almost as many people as bullets or explosives. The combat, which began with tanks and aerial bombardment, was quickly reduced to hand-to-hand combat, where people fought with bayonets, shovels, and bare fists. Every room was a fortress to be conquered. Both sides knew that whoever emerged victorious in this conflict would be one step closer to achieving final victory. In fact, the orders coming from their leaders were clear. Surrender was forbidden. They had to fight until the last drop of blood. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about Stalingrad, the most brutal battle of World War II.
Dieses Gefühl habe ich heute immer noch. Die waren alle so jung und so lebensfreudig. Es waren auch schon ein paar Ältere dabei, aber gelebt hat jeder gerne. Und ich sage es ganz offen und ehrlich, ich bin von Stalingrad rausgekommen, aber so richtig von Herzen drüber freuen kann ich mich nicht, weil ich immer wieder daran denken muss.
The action that led to this bloody battle was Operation Barbarossa. This was the name given to the massive German invasion of Soviet territory that began on June 22, 1941. The Nazis' goal was to defeat their enemies in one swift and brutal blow, thanks to their blitzkrieg strategy. Hitler and his generals viewed the Red Army as a body of poorly trained and poorly equipped soldiers, led by inexperienced military personnel. Although the Russians greatly outnumbered them, the Germans were confident that their superior tactics would bring them victory. Let's listen to a historian talking about the Führer's reasons for invading the Soviet Union.
Adolf Hitler es uno de los hombres más estudiados de la historia y uno de los más malvados. Pensaba que la naturaleza fundamental de la lucha humana era la lucha entre las razas. Para él, la Unión Soviética unía los dos peores males. En sus propias palabras, el bolchevismo y el judaísmo, y era la mayor amenaza para la raza aria.
The attack was divided into three fronts. The Northern Army Corps would aim for the city of Leningrad. In the center, they would advance to take Moscow, the capital of the Union. In the south, German and Allied troops were to conquer the fertile Ukrainian fields and the oil-rich territory of the Caucasus. Depriving the Soviets of this source of energy basically guaranteed German victory, since their tanks and planes, among other vehicles, would be unusable. In addition, the capture of all this land expansion would serve the Nazis to expand what they called Lebensraum, or living space. This was the name given to the area required by the Aryan man for his survival, which, according to the party, was threatened by his neighbors. The other side of the coin was that the Slavic population native to these desired areas had to be exterminated, since coexistence between the Germans and these peoples was seen as impossible. For the first few months, the invasion went almost exactly as Hitler had planned. Soviet troops were overwhelmed by the German blitzkrieg, and forced to give up large tracts of land in a very short time. Their soldiers were falling in droves, and their vehicles were destroyed by the hundreds. By the end of 1941, the Axis armies were close to achieving their objectives. Leningrad was under siege, fierce fighting was raging around Moscow, and much of Ukraine had already been conquered. Although the advance slowed down at the end of the year, that is, during the winter, Hitler was confident of a quick victory that would guarantee the end of the Soviet Union and the dominance of the Reich. But in both the north and the center, the situation became more complicated than expected. Despite the brutal siege, the city of Leningrad did not fall, and never would. On the other hand, Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, had taken special interest in ensuring that Moscow was not in Nazi hands under any circumstances. Russian counterattacks concentrated on this city and were so ferocious that they marked the first major defeat of German forces in the war, inflicting significant losses in men and equipment. Thus, with the front bogged down in these two regions, for the spring 1942 campaign, Hitler focused his operations on the south. With the Ukrainian countryside already conquered, the next German objective was the Caucasus. But to get there, Stalingrad had to be taken first. This city controlled access to the Volga River, which served as a key communication route for the entire Soviet Union. It was also an important industrial center for the country, with a large number of factories producing various types of equipment. But beyond these economic and logistical aspects, conquering the city that bore the name of the Soviet leader would have a very important ideological value. In a statement to his generals, Hitler had said that after Stalingrad was under his control, the entire male population was to be eliminated, since they were completely communist. Women and children were to be deported into the interior of the Reich and put to forced labor. The brutality, however, had begun long before the arrival, as recounted by a Soviet soldier in the following video.
Los alemanes lanzaban panfletos con la siguiente leyenda: pequeños demonios de Stalin, luchad contra vuestros comandantes. Rendíos o de lo contrario seréis destruidos. Uno de aquellos días, la distancia entre líneas era de 300 metros. Los alemanes anunciaban por sus altavoces: mirad lo que os pasará si no os rendís. Vimos cómo sacaban a 4 personas medio desnudas de su fortificación y las fusilaban.
Following the failure of the Moscow campaign, the Führer had appointed himself supreme commander of the military forces. Overruling more experienced generals, he divided the Southern Army Corps into two. One group would continue to advance toward the Caucasus, while the other would attack Stalingrad. Realizing what the Germans were planning to do, Stalin, who had imagined that his enemy would focus on the capital, began to order the mobilization of troops toward the city that bore his name. He also refused to evacuate the approximately 400,000 civilians, since he needed them to continue working in the factories and helping the Soviet war effort. It is also said that he did not do so because he thought that this would make the Red Army soldiers fight more fervently to defend their own. What he did move was a large part of the grain and livestock reserves into the interior of the country. While this deprived the Germans of any potential access to these food sources, the same thing happened to their own people. On August 23, 1942, the German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, was on the outskirts of Stalingrad. The battle began with a brutal bombing of the city by the Luftwaffe, the Nazi Air Force. 1,000 tons of bombs, many of them incendiary, were dropped in just 2 days. 90% of homes were destroyed in this first attack alone. Civilian casualties were extremely high, estimated at 40,000. Those who were able to escape were captured by the invaders and deported to Germany. Despite the destruction, industries that were not reduced to rubble continued to produce goods and equipment. Tanks were finished and launched into combat on the same day. By the time the initial bombing raids ended, the city was unrecognizable. Explosives and fire had turned Stalingrad into a ruin. However, there was still much to be done. Ground fighting quickly broke out between attackers and defenders. German tanks rolled through the sea of rubble, while the Soviets engaged them with improvised weapons. Civilians not working in the factories were sent to fight at the front, sometimes without rifles. Women, who had originally served in the army in support roles as nurses or administrative staff, were now an important part of the defending forces. In one of these early engagements, a regiment partially staffed by women engaged German battleships with anti-aircraft batteries. By the end of the engagement, they had incurred a heavy toll, with 28 enemy tanks destroyed. The Russians fought with a ferocity that surprised the invaders, who imagined that by now they would be close to collapse. This is what a veteran of this conflict tells us below.
At the time, we firmly believed that Germans would kill us in any case, and this very fact drove us to fight until the end. And we did, each one of us in his own way. We were doing what we were supposed to do.
However, this did not mean that the Germans were defeated. On the contrary, although the fighting was intense and there were heavy casualties on both sides, the attackers had the upper hand. By the last days of August, they had almost completely taken control of the Volga River. To deliver resources to the overstretched defenders, the Soviets' only option was through incredibly dangerous water crossings. Harassed by artillery and aircraft, most of these efforts ended in disaster. In September, urban combat intensified. Stalin's men continually counterattacked the Germans. Although these operations were disorganized and not very successful, they did serve to delay the Nazi advance. Every factory, building, and house was now fought over. Fighting often came down to hand-to-hand combat because both sides were so close together. The Germans, while still logistically superior, were beginning to realize how difficult it would be to take the city. One Reich officer even said that France had surrendered in less time than it took to take a single factory in Stalingrad. The invaders' morale was falling, while Soviet propaganda in its publications was praising the heroic defenders of the city. Ironically, the Nazis' thirst for destruction worked against them. The immense amount of rubble made it difficult for their tanks to move, making one of their greatest advantages over the Red Army ineffective. In this rat war, as the Germans bitterly called it, snipers on both sides began to take on a role. While the infantry fought fiercely in a building, for example, one of these soldiers waited patiently for a high-ranking officer to poke his head out. Women who, as mentioned, were already employed as combatants in the Red Army, were in high demand for this position. Their generally smaller bodies made for a silhouette that was harder for enemies to discern. In addition to officers, the targets of these men and women were often soldiers tasked with bringing supplies, such as ammunition, water, or food to the front. The best-known sniper of the Battle of Stalingrad, not to mention in war history, was Vasily Zaitsev. He is credited with 225 enemy kills. He was used as a heroic symbol by Soviet propaganda, which recounted, and sometimes exaggerated, his exploits. This was often the case with other such skilled men and women, as a former German soldier recounts in the following video.
Das haben wir eben festgestellt, der Russe hatte aber eben zu dieser Zeit schon auf Scharfschützen erheblich mehr Wert gelegt und der hatte tatsächlich die Ausrüstung mit Zielfernrohren, war bei dem Russen zweifellos zu dieser Zeit damals, wie wir dann feststellten, wohl stärker und größer als bei uns. Dazu kommt noch, dass wir jetzt festgestellt haben, dass der Russe diese Scharfschützen bei ihren Erfolgen auch rein aus propagandistischen Gründen besonders hochgehoben und als Helden gefeiert hat.
The exploitation of urban tactics gave the defenders an advantage, although their situation remained extremely difficult. The Soviets, in order to reduce their casualties, began to attack at night, using the city's sewers to move behind enemy lines. This prevented the Germans from sleeping peacefully, as they never knew when the Russian bullets would start flying. Buildings were mined, abandoned houses were booby-trapped, and tanks were hidden among the ruins. In this way, the invaders were constantly taken by surprise. Both sides began to use the strategy of outnumbering the enemy, launching massive attacks regardless of the number of dead or collateral damage. But the Nazis were isolated. The rest of the armies were on the Eastern Front, busy with other engagements. On the other hand, the Soviets were constantly receiving reinforcements, which seemed to have no end. The battle continued for months, with the dead piling up on both sides. By the end of November 1942, the Germans controlled 90% of Stalingrad. The locals had been driven to a small, albeit highly fortified strip of land. But now a factor was about to enter the picture that would determine the fate of this conflict. The dreaded Russian winter was fast approaching. While it froze the waters of the Volga, rendering the Red Army unable to reinforce its men, the weather would have far more severe consequences for the invaders. The extreme cold, coupled with hunger and epidemic disease, killed almost as many Germans as Russian weapons. The temperature could reach 40 degrees below zero, causing many men to lose body parts to frostbite. Those who died of hypothermia had become a macabre decoration on the battlefront. Because of the number of those affected, German medicines quickly ran out, and surgeries had to be performed without anesthesia. While hunger hurt both sides, the Soviets were better prepared for these conditions. Still, soldiers on both fronts and civilians were forced to take extreme measures to survive, such as eating mud and snow. Seeing that the Germans were ill-prepared, the Soviet High Command finally set its plans in motion. Since August 1942, forces had been massing in the steppes north and south of Stalingrad for an eventual attack. Marshal Zhukov, one of the Red Army's most senior officers, and in charge of the city's defense, noted that the German flanks were weakened. These were largely made up of Romanian and Hungarian soldiers, allies of Germany, but without its training and experience. Earlier, Nazi General Paulus had asked the Führer for permission to reinforce these areas, but Hitler had refused, as not even an inch of ground could be conceded to the enemy. With the onset of winter, Zhukov saw his opportunity. Wasting no time, the Soviet counteroffensive was launched against these lines on November 19th, under the name Operation Uranus, in 2 simultaneous attacks. The weakened Axis forces were overwhelmed by the emboldened soldiers of the Red Army, having been taken by surprise. Their responses were chaotic and poorly planned. In addition, the bad weather made the German Air Force ineffective against the attackers. Stalin's tanks ran over the troops of the German allies, which were mostly made up of infantry. Below, we can hear how this operation was planned.
La Operación Urano fue el esfuerzo soviético por cerrar el círculo, para aplicar dos pinzas masivas, una por el norte y otra por el sur. Los soviéticos sabían que las líneas alemanas eran débiles y pronto las atravesaron.
On November 23rd, the two prongs of the Soviet attack linked up, completely encircling Paulus's 6th Army. Some 265,000 men were now trapped by the Russian ring. The cold reached its most extreme temperatures, with men dying by the hundreds each day. Despite the hopelessness of their position, the trapped Germans were not allowed to try to break out of the encirclement. Stalingrad could not be abandoned under any circumstances. The Nazis attempted to break this encirclement with the armies that had managed to escape the trap through Operation Winter Storm. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe would airlift supplies to the desperate German soldiers. But the numbers they needed were enormous. 700 tons of supplies per day were needed to keep the fight going. For more than 2 months, planes dropped food, medicine, and ammunition, but they never reached the quantities the troops needed. Even useless objects were sometimes thrown in, such as 4 tons of pepper and thousands of propaganda leaflets. The failure of both the relief operation and the attempts to break the encirclement made the German situation critical. They could no longer even bury their dead. Every day, cold, epidemics, thirst, and hunger claimed the lives of hundreds of people. The seriously wounded were no longer treated, and orders were given to shoot only when they were sure of hitting the target, so as not to waste ammunition. Many Germans committed suicide in these dark days, seeing that there was no escape from their situation. Paulus knew that the chances of a Nazi victory were zero. On January 10, 1943, the Soviets contacted the German general to give him the opportunity to surrender. But Hitler's orders remained the same. They had to fight to the last man. So Paulus was forced to continue fighting. On January 22nd, the Red Army captured the only remaining German airbase, preventing further supplies from arriving. The German leader contacted the Führer again to reiterate his call for capitulation. Hitler instead promoted him to field marshal. Now, if Paulus surrendered, he would be the only one of that rank in German history to do so. It was, in essence, an invitation to suicide to save the Reich's honor. However, the general had no intention of complying. On February 2nd, just as a new attack collapsed on the defenders, Paulus surrendered to Soviet forces. Of the nearly 300,000 men who had been surrounded, 91,000 remained in appalling conditions. Many of them could barely move and died while being transported to prisoner-of-war camps. Paulus, furious with Hitler's senseless orders, became one of his most vocal whistleblowers from Moscow. You can see footage of the mass surrender below.
The hammer and sickle of the Red Army completely broke down the enemy's will to fight, and the Russians are reaping the reward of their gigantic efforts as at point after point, whole detachments of German troops give themselves up. Now the white flag of capitulation has taken the place of the crooked cross.
From the beginning of the battle to its end, an estimated 2 million people lost their lives, including Axis troops, Soviet soldiers, and civilians. It was the bloodiest and longest battle of the entire Second World War. It was also one of the most important. It marked the turning point of the conflict, as Germany would never recover from this defeat and would enter into a retreat that would last until its surrender in Berlin. We've reached the end of the video, and we don't want to leave without first asking you, what amazes you most about the Battle of Stalingrad? Leave us your answer in the comments box below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.